Some men inherit kingdoms. Others burn everything standing and build empires from the ash. Duke Lucien Ravenscroft did both before his 30th birthday, and the northern territories of England learned to speak his name the way sailors speak of storms, quietly, and never without looking over their shoulders first. But power built on fear carries a weight most men never survive. And when the one thing he could not control walked through his gates wearing nothing but composure and a borrowed gown, the Duke discovered something far more dangerous than any rebellion. If you think you know where this ends, stay until the last word, because this story does not go where you expect, not even close. The funeral procession moved through the village of Ashworth beneath a sky the color of wet iron. 47 men on horseback, black coats, black gloves, rifles strapped across their backs like instruments waiting to be played. At the center of the column rode a carriage draped in Ravenscroft crimson, carrying nothing inside except a sealed oak casket and the silence of a man who refused to mourn publicly. Duke Lucien Ravenscroft sat his warhorse at the front of the line with his jaw locked and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He was 31 years old, 6 feet 2 inches of controlled violence wrapped in tailored wool and polished leather. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that might have been handsome if it ever learned how to soften. It never had. The scar running from his left temple to the edge of his jawline made certain no one mistook him for anything other than what he was. A man who had survived things most people only read about in newspapers. The villagers lined the road in clusters. Women held children against their hips. Old men removed their hats. No one waved. No one called out blessings for the departed. They simply watched the way animals watch a fire moving across a dry field, motionless, calculating distance, preparing to run. The man inside the casket was Gerald Hastings, steward of Blackmoor Keep for 22 years, trusted advisor to 2 generations of Ravenscrofts, and the only person inside the estate who had ever placed a hand on Lucien's shoulder without flinching. He died 3 nights ago in his sleep, quietly, mercifully, the way decent men sometimes leave a world that stopped deserving them. Lucien had not spoken a single word since receiving the news, not because grief overwhelmed him. Lucien Ravenscroft did not permit grief to function inside his body the way ordinary men allowed it. He compressed it, locked it somewhere behind his ribs, where it could burn without producing smoke. What consumed him instead was something colder, something mechanical. Gerald was the last person alive who remembered what Lucien looked like before the war, before the inheritance, before the years of blood that turned a young man's heart into something resembling architecture more than anatomy, structured, load-bearing, designed to hold weight rather than feel warmth. Now the final witness was gone, and Lucien rode through Ashworth feeling nothing except the precise awareness that he was, at last, completely alone. The column reached the Ravenscroft family cemetery at the edge of the cliffs overlooking the North Sea. Wind tore across the headstones carrying salt and the memory of every storm that ever battered this coastline. Lucien dismounted without assistance. His boots struck frozen earth. He stood at the open grave while his men lowered the casket, and the chaplain read words Lucien did not hear. When it was finished, he turned to his senior captain. "Double the perimeter guard at Blackmoor tonight." Captain Harlan Drake studied the Duke's face carefully. Drake was 53, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a knife fight in Manchester 16 years ago. He had served Lucien since the Inheritance Wars and understood his commander the way a hunting dog understands weather, not through language, but through pressure changes. "Expecting trouble?" "I buried the last man I trusted," Lucien said without inflection. Every ambitious fool within 200 miles just smelled opportunity. Drake nodded once and moved to relay orders. Lucien stood at Gerald's grave alone for 11 minutes. He counted them. Counting was a discipline he had practiced since childhood, measuring silence, measuring patience, measuring exactly how long vulnerability could be permitted before it became a liability. 11 minutes. Then he buried whatever remained of sentiment inside the frozen ground beside the casket and walked back toward Blackmoor Keep without looking over his shoulder. The fortress waited for him the way it always did, patient, cold, unapologetic. Blackmoor Keep was not a home. It was a statement. Built 3 centuries ago from granite quarried out of the cliffs themselves, the estate rose above the coastline like a clenched fist raised against the sea. Its towers caught wind and held it prisoner. Its corridors amplified footsteps into percussion. Every room was designed to remind anyone who entered that comfort was not the purpose of this place. Control was the purpose. And Lucien had perfected that purpose over the past decade with surgical precision. Inside the main hall, servants moved through their routines with the efficiency of people who understood that mistakes carried consequences. Not cruelty. Lucien did not beat his staff or starve his workers. He was not a monster in the traditional sense, but he maintained an atmosphere of absolute expectation that produced the same results fear would have produced: obedience born from the understanding that the Duke noticed everything and forgot nothing. A maid who left dust on a mantelpiece found herself reassigned before sunset. A footman who whispered gossip about estate business was dismissed within the hour. A cook who served a cold plate once never served a cold plate again. Lucien walked through the main corridor toward his study, and every person he passed adjusted their posture. Spines straightened, eyes lowered. Conversations died mid-sentence and were not resumed until his footsteps faded completely. He entered the study alone and closed the door behind him. The room was sparse by aristocratic standards. A mahogany desk the size of a dining table, maps covering 3 walls, a single window overlooking the cliffs where waves hammered stone 100 feet below. No paintings, no decorative objects, no personal artifacts except a small brass compass on the desk that had belonged to his father. Lucien sat down and opened the ledger Gerald had been maintaining before his death. The numbers told stories most people could not read. Trade revenues from the northern shipping routes were declining. Grain prices fluctuated because 2 ministers in Parliament were manipulating supply contracts. 3 tenant villages were falling behind on payments, not from laziness, but from systematic exploitation by middlemen Lucien had not yet identified. He read for 2 hours without moving. Then a knock interrupted the silence. "Enter." The door opened and Malcolm Graves stepped inside. Graves served as Lucien's chief political advisor. A thin, meticulous man in his late 40s with spectacles that sat crookedly on a narrow nose and eyes that cataloged information the way librarians catalog books. He was not loyal to Lucien out of affection. He was loyal because Lucien was the most effective instrument of order he had ever encountered, and Malcolm Graves valued order above all things. "The delegation from Parliament has confirmed their arrival for Thursday," Graves said. "Lord Ashbourne leads the committee." Lucien did not look up from the ledger. "Cedric." "Lord Cedric Ashbourne," Graves confirmed carefully. "He requested formal quarters inside Blackmoor for the duration of the review." "Did he?" "He claims Parliament requires an inspection of northern trade accounts. Routine oversight, according to the official correspondence." Lucien closed the ledger slowly. The sound of leather binding meeting wood carried more weight than any spoken word in that room. "Nothing Cedric Ashbourne does is routine," Graves adjusted his spectacles. "Should I deny the request?" "No." Lucien leaned back in his chair. "Give him the east wing, the rooms with the thinnest walls." Graves understood immediately. Rooms where conversations carried. Rooms where a man's private discussions could be monitored without his knowledge. "There is another matter," Graves continued. "The delegation includes several accompanying families, among them Viscount Aldrich Vale and his daughter." "Vale." Lucien turned the name over like a coin whose value he was assessing. "The bankrupt." "Spectacularly bankrupt. 3 estates seized, debts exceeding £40,000. The family survives entirely on political charity at this point." "And he brings his daughter to Blackmoor?" Graves hesitated. This was unusual for him. Malcolm Graves did not hesitate the way emotional men hesitated. From uncertainty. He hesitated because the information he was about to deliver required careful framing. Lady Seraphina Vale has developed something of a reputation in London circles. Not scandal, precisely. More disruption. She was dismissed from Lord Pemberton's household after publicly correcting his accounting practices during a dinner party. She exposed a fraudulent insurance scheme operated by the Marchioness of Whitfield. Twice, she has testified before minor parliamentary committees on matters of trade regulation. A woman testifying before Parliament, Uninvited, both times. She simply arrived with documentation and spoke until the committee either listened or adjourned. Lucien studied Graves for a long moment. And her father brings this woman to my estate. Viscount Vale likely believes a political marriage to a powerful house will solve his financial difficulties. The daughter is merely currency in that transaction. Is she aware of that? Graves paused again. That, Your Grace, I genuinely cannot determine. Lucien turned back toward the window. Waves crashed against the cliffs below in rhythms that never changed, never accelerated, never showed mercy to the stone they were slowly dismantling. Prepare for Thursday, full security. I want every member of Cedric's delegation watched from the moment they cross our borders. Graves nodded and withdrew. Lucien sat alone in the fading light for a long time after that. He thought about Gerald, about the way the old steward used to stand in this very room and tell him things he did not want to hear. Gerald was the only man who ever looked at Lucien Ravenscroft and saw something other than the weapon the world had forced him to become. Now Gerald was dead, and Cedric Ashbourne was coming to Blackmoor. There is a particular kind of danger that announces itself not with noise but with excellent manners and parliamentary letterhead. Lucien had survived assassins, financial sabotage, and outright military threats from rival houses during the consolidation years. None of those enemies frightened him. Cedric Ashbourne frightened him. Not because Cedric was physically dangerous. The man was 44 years old, elegantly built, with silver temples and a smile that could charm investors while his accountants emptied their vaults. He moved through political society with the fluid precision of a predator who had learned to walk upright and hold a wine glass. What made Cedric dangerous was patience. Every other rival Lucien had destroyed made the same mistake. They acted from emotion, ambition, desperation, pride. Those motivations created patterns. Patterns created vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities created opportunities for a man disciplined enough to wait. Cedric never acted from emotion. He acted from architecture. Every move was structural. Every alliance was load-bearing. Every friendship was engineered to support a larger design that only Cedric himself could see in its entirety. Lucien respected that. And respect, in the Duke's vocabulary, was simply another word for threat assessment. Thursday arrived beneath clouds so thick the morning looked like dusk. The delegation rode through Blackmoor's main gate at precisely 11 o'clock, a display of punctuality that was itself a political statement. 12 carriages, 40 riders. Banners representing 6 noble houses, each one chosen carefully to communicate a unified front. Lucien watched from the tower window above the courtyard. Cedric Ashbourne emerged from the lead carriage wearing a charcoal coat trimmed in silver that probably cost more than most tenant farmers earned in a year. He looked up at the keep with the expression of a man appraising property he intended to acquire. Lucien felt his jaw tighten. Behind Cedric's carriage, other families began emerging into the cold courtyard air. Politicians and their wives, minor lords seeking visibility, career diplomats measuring every handshake for future leverage. Then the last carriage opened. Viscount Aldrich Vale stepped out first, a thin, diminished man whose expensive clothing could not disguise the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent years watching his world disintegrate, one creditor at a time. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his collar. His eyes moved too quickly, scanning faces for judgment. Behind him, a woman descended from the carriage without assistance. Lucien leaned forward slightly. She was not beautiful in the way London society defined beauty. Porcelain and submission wrapped in silk designed to signal availability. She was something else entirely. Average height. Dark hair pulled back simply without the elaborate architecture most noblewomen employed. A green traveling dress that fit well, but was clearly not new. No jewels, no ornamentation, no effort whatsoever to perform wealth she did not possess. What stopped Lucien was her posture. She stood in the courtyard of the most feared estate in northern England and looked around with the calm assessment of an architect studying a building's structural integrity. Not intimidated, not performing confidence to disguise fear, simply observing. She noticed the placement of guards along the walls. She studied the condition of the cobblestones. She watched servants moving between carriages and catalogued their behavior with eyes that processed information the way Lucien's own mind processed information. structurally, systematically, without sentiment. Then she looked up, directly at his window. Lucien stepped back from the glass reflexively, a response so foreign to his behavioral discipline that it disturbed him more than the eye contact itself. He had not stepped back from anything in 10 years. The welcoming reception took place in Blackmoor's great hall, where firelight fought unsuccessfully against the permanent cold that lived inside the stone walls. Lucien stood at the head of the room in full formal dress, black coat, Ravenscroft crest in silver at his collar, boots polished to a mirror finish. Every element of his appearance communicated a single message. "You are in my territory now." The nobles filed past him, offering rehearsed pleasantries. Lucien responded to each with precisely calibrated courtesy, warm enough to satisfy protocol, cold enough to remind every person in the room that warmth was a privilege he could withdraw at any moment. Cedric Ashbourne approached with the confidence of a man who believed himself an equal. "Your Grace," Cedric extended his hand. "Blackmoor is as imposing as ever. One might almost forget it is a home and not a military installation. One might almost forget you are a guest and not an inspector," Lucien replied, taking the hand briefly. "But we both know accuracy matters, Cedric." Something flickered behind Cedric's eyes, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second. Annoyance, compressed and redirected before it could reach his smile. "Parliament simply wishes to ensure northern trade revenues align with reported figures. Transparency strengthens trust between houses." "Transparency?" Lucien released his hand. "I was not aware Parliament practiced that particular virtue." Cedric laughed, the specific laugh of a man who files away insults for later use. "You are as direct as your reputation suggests, Lucien. And you are exactly as diplomatic. Shall I show you to the East Wing?" The exchange lasted 40 seconds. Both men understood everything that had been communicated beneath the words. This was not an inspection. This was reconnaissance, and both men now understood the other knew it. After Cedric moved away, the receiving line continued. Viscount Vale approached with his daughter. "Your Grace," Vale began, his voice carrying the careful brightness of a man performing solvency. "Allow me to present my daughter, Lady Seraphina. She has been most eager to—" "Father." Seraphina's voice was quiet, but it severed his sentence as cleanly as a blade. "The Duke does not need a sales presentation." The silence that followed was specific, not the silence of a room going quiet. The silence of several dozen aristocrats simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of what was happening. Lucien studied her. Up close, the impression from the window sharpened into focus. Her eyes were dark brown, the color of strong tea held against firelight. They held his gaze without challenge, but without retreat. There was no flirtation in them, no performance, no strategy he could immediately identify. That bothered him. Lucien could read every person in this room within seconds. He understood their motivations, their fears, their pressure points. Reading people was not a talent. It was a survival mechanism he had developed during the years when reading people incorrectly meant dying. Seraphina's face gave him nothing. "Lady Vale," he said, "Your Grace." "Your father's introduction was unnecessary. I am familiar with your reputation." "Then you know I tend to make powerful men uncomfortable." Several nearby conversations stopped. Lucien felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic adjustment so subtle he almost missed it. It was not attraction, not exactly. It was the sensation of encountering something he had not anticipated, something his calculations had not accounted for. He had not experienced that sensation in years. "Discomfort requires vulnerability," Lucien answered carefully. "I do not suffer from that particular condition." "Everyone suffers from it," Seraphina said. "Some are simply better at hiding the symptoms." She offered a small nod, respectful but entirely devoid of deference, and moved past him into the hall. Lucien watched her go. Behind him, Graves appeared at his shoulder. "Interesting," the advisor murmured. "Dangerous," Lucien corrected. "Those are frequently the same thing, Your Grace." The first council session convened the following morning in Blackmoor's formal chamber, a vaulted room where decisions had shaped northern England for 3 centuries. Lucien sat at the head of a long oak table, while Cedric's parliamentary delegation arranged themselves opposite like opposing counsel in a trial. The agenda was trade revenue. The subtext was control. Cedric opened with surgical precision. His tone was warm, collegial, the voice of a reasonable man asking reasonable questions. He presented discrepancies in shipping manifests. He referenced inconsistencies between reported grain yields and market prices. He framed every accusation as a concern and every attack as an inquiry. Lucien answered each point with data pulled from memory so precisely that two of Cedric's junior ministers visibly paled. He did not consult documents. He did not defer to advisors. He recited figures, dates, contract terms, and trade volumes with the mechanical accuracy of a man whose mind organized information the way fortresses organize defenses, in layers with redundancies designed to withstand assault. Cedric adjusted his approach 3 times during the session. Each adjustment was subtle. Each was noted. Midway through the 3rd hour, the discussion turned to tenant farming revenues and the taxation structures affecting northern villages. Cedric presented a series of documents suggesting Blackmoor's tenant agreements were exploitative, structured to maximize ducal income while systematically impoverishing farming communities. "These are serious allegations," Cedric said, spreading papers across the table with the theatrical care of a man presenting evidence in court. "Parliament has received formal complaints from multiple village representatives." Lucien glanced at the documents. "Those complaints were drafted in London," he said flatly. "The handwriting belongs to your assistant, Cedric. The paper stock is Whitmore and Sons, which supplies your parliamentary office exclusively, and the signatures at the bottom are from 3 men who have been dead for over a year." The room went silent. Cedric's expression did not change. That was the most unsettling thing about it. A less disciplined man would have shown surprise, anger, embarrassment. Cedric simply absorbed the exposure the way stone absorbs rain, without visible effect, without acknowledgement, without any indication that the surface had been touched at all. "Administrative oversights," Cedric said smoothly. "I will have my staff review the documentation." "You will do more than that." Lucien leaned forward. "You will withdraw those documents from the parliamentary record by Friday. Or I will present my own documentation to the House of Lords detailing exactly how they were fabricated." The threat was delivered without volume, without drama, without any of the theatrical energy that lesser men employed when making threats. Lucien simply stated a consequence the way an engineer states the load capacity of a bridge, factually, precisely, with absolute confidence in the mathematics. Cedric held his gaze for 5 seconds. Then he smiled. "Of course, Your Grace, accuracy matters." The session ended. But as the ministers filed out, Lucien noticed something that pulled his attention away from Cedric entirely. Serafina Vale stood near the back of the chamber. She had not been invited. She had no official role in the proceedings. Yet she was there, standing quietly near a window with a small leather journal in her hands, and Lucien realized with sudden clarity that she had been taking notes throughout the entire session. Not social observations, not gossip material, she had been tracking the financial data. "Lady Vale!" Lucien's voice stopped the room. Ministers froze mid-step. Cedric paused at the doorway and turned back. "This chamber is restricted to authorized council members." Serafina closed her journal calmly. "I was not aware observation required authorization. In my estate, everything requires authorization." "Then perhaps your estate should consider whether controlling information and understanding information are the same thing." She looked at him directly. "Because from what I observed today, at least 4 of the revenue figures your opponent presented were fabricated, but 3 of yours were deliberately understated, which means both sides of this table are performing honesty rather than practicing it." The silence that followed was absolute. Lucien felt his pulse shift, not from anger, from the visceral recognition that this woman had just done something no advisor, no minister, no political ally had ever done in the entire history of his rule. She had caught him, not in a lie, in a strategy. She had identified the gap between what he presented and what was real. And she had said it out loud in front of the very people he was maneuvering against. Cedric watched the exchange from the doorway with an expression Lucien recognized immediately. Interest, The specific interest of a predator who has just identified a new variable in the hunting ground. Lucien stood slowly. "Leave us," he said to the room. Everyone moved except Serafina. When the door closed, they stood facing each other across 20 feet of cold stone floor. "You have either extraordinary courage or catastrophic judgment," Lucien said quietly. "You have either extraordinary control or catastrophic loneliness," Serafina answered. "I have not determined which yet." Lucien crossed 3 steps toward her before he caught himself. The movement was involuntary, magnetic, the kind of motion that happens when the body recognizes something the mind has not yet processed. He stopped. She did not step back. "What do you want, Lady Vale?" "Honesty." "From a duke?" "From anyone. It is the rarest currency in England, and this estate is no exception." Lucien studied her for a long, dangerous moment. "Your father brought you here to sell you into a political marriage." "My father brought me here because he is desperate and I am the only asset he has left." Her voice did not waver. "But I am not a woman who allows herself to be sold by anyone." "Then why did you come?" Serafina held his gaze. "Because Blackmoor Keep is the most powerful estate in northern England, and it is being run by a man who controls everything except the one thing that will eventually destroy him." "And what is that?" "His inability to trust anyone who tells him the truth." The words landed in the center of Lucien's chest like a fist wrapped in silk, not because they were harsh, because they were accurate. Surgically, devastatingly accurate, delivered by a woman who had been inside his estate for less than 48 hours, and had already identified the structural weakness that 10 years of political warfare had failed to expose. Lucien said nothing for a very long time. Then he turned toward the door. "Graves will assign you access to the estate library. The financial records you need are in the 3rd archive. Do not touch anything in the restricted section." He left without looking back. But in the corridor outside, Lucien stopped walking. He pressed one hand against the cold stone wall and stood completely still while something inside his chest rearranged itself without permission. He did not understand it. He did not trust it, and that terrified him more than Cedric Ashbourne's entire conspiracy. That evening, while Blackmoor settled into darkness and the North Sea hammered the cliffs below, Lucien sat alone in his study reviewing intelligence reports. Trade disruptions, missing shipments, 3 informants gone silent in London. All patterns, all connected. Cedric was building something. Then Graves knocked and entered without waiting, a breach of protocol that told Lucien whatever followed was urgent. "We intercepted a message," Graves said. His voice was flat, controlled. The specific tone he used when delivering information that changed the shape of everything. "From Lord Ashbourne's quarters, sent by courier an hour ago." He placed a decoded letter on the desk. Lucien read it once, then he read it again. His hands did not shake. His expression did not change. But inside his chest, something cold and precise clicked into place. The mechanism of a man whose worst suspicions had just been confirmed. The letter was addressed to 4 noble houses. It outlined a coordinated plan to strip Lucien of his ducal authority through parliamentary vote, seize Blackmoor's trade routes, and redistribute northern territories among Cedric's allies. The timeline was 6 weeks. But that was not what stopped Lucien's breathing. At the bottom of the letter, in Cedric's own handwriting, was a single additional line. "The Vale woman is the key. Turn her, and the Duke falls." Lucien read the letter a 3rd time, then a 4th. Not because comprehension failed him, but because his mind required repetition to separate the tactical implications from the single visceral reaction threatening to compromise his judgment. She is the key. 3 words. Written in Cedric Ashbourne's precise, elegant handwriting beneath a conspiracy designed to dismantle everything Lucien had spent a decade building. 3 words that transformed Serafina Vale from an anomaly into a weapon, either aimed at him or waiting to be aimed at him. And in Lucien's experience, the distinction between those 2 conditions was purely academic. He placed the letter face down on the desk. "How many copies were sent?" Graves stood near the door with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture communicating the particular rigidity of a man who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine the trajectory of everything that followed. The courier carried 4 sealed duplicates. Our man intercepted the set before it cleared Blackmoor's outer perimeter. Lord Ashbourne does not yet know the message failed to reach its recipients. Which houses? Pemberton, Carrick, Haldane, Montclair. Lucien exhaled slowly through his nose. 4 houses. 4 of the 7 families whose combined parliamentary votes could trigger a formal inquiry into ducal authority. Cedric had not chosen allies, he had chosen a quorum. 6 weeks, Lucien said, according to the timeline outlined in the letter. He will accelerate now that he is inside Blackmoor. Proximity changes the calculus. He can read our operations directly instead of relying on informants. Graves adjusted his spectacles. Shall I arrange for Lord Ashbourne's removal from the estate? A diplomatic pretext could be manufactured within hours. No. Your Grace, if I expel Cedric now, I confirm that I intercepted the letter. He restructures the conspiracy outside my surveillance, and I lose visibility into every alliance he has built. Lucien stood and moved toward the window. The North Sea was invisible in the darkness, but he could hear it, that relentless percussion of water against cliff face that had been the soundtrack of his entire life. The advantage is not in removing Cedric from Blackmoor. The advantage is in letting him believe he is still operating undetected. Graves was quiet for a moment. And Lady Vale? Lucien's reflection stared back at him from the dark glass, a face stripped of everything except calculation. He had worn that face for so long he sometimes forgot there had been another one beneath it. Younger, less armored, capable of expressions that did not serve strategic purposes. What do you know about her relationship with Ashbourne? Nothing definitive. She arrived with her father's delegation, which traveled independently from Lord Ashbourne's party. There are no financial connections between the Vale and Ashbourne families that I have been able to identify. No correspondence, no shared social circles. That means nothing. Cedric would not leave a visible thread connecting himself to an operative. You believe she is working with him? Lucien pressed his thumb against the cold glass. I believe that a bankrupt viscount's daughter, with a reputation for exposing financial fraud, arrives at my estate at precisely the same moment a conspiracy to destroy me reaches its operational phase. I believe that this woman walked into a restricted council session, uninvited, and publicly identified weaknesses in my financial reporting that no outside analyst should have been able to detect within 48 hours. And I believe that Cedric Ashbourne does not write a woman's name into a conspiracy document unless he has already determined exactly how she will be used. He turned from the window. The question is whether she knows she is being used. And if she does not, then she is vulnerable. And vulnerable people inside my estate during a political war are either assets or casualties. He sat back down and pulled the letter toward him one final time. There is no third category. Graves studied the Duke's face with the careful attention of a man who had served him long enough to recognize the difference between strategic analysis and something more personal operating beneath it. He chose not to comment on what he observed. Malcolm Graves had not survived 20 years in political intelligence by identifying emotions out loud. I will increase surveillance on both parties, Graves said. Discreetly. Do it. Graves withdrew. Lucien sat alone in the study until the candles burned to their bases and shadows reclaimed the room entirely. He did not move. He did not read. He sat in the darkness and listened to the sea and conducted a private inventory of every interaction he had shared with Seraphina Vale since her arrival. Her composure in the courtyard, the way she had silenced her own father mid-sentence without cruelty but without hesitation. The precision of her observations during the council session, the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with desire, not with the calculated warmth of a woman executing a seduction strategy. She had looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a patient, identifying the wound, measuring its depth, deciding whether the damage was operable, his inability to trust anyone who tells him the truth. The words replayed inside his skull like a percussion instrument struck once and left to reverberate. She had named the structural failure at the center of his entire existence with the casual accuracy of someone reading a temperature gauge. And the most disturbing element was not what she had said. It was that some fractured, buried part of him had recognized it as true. Lucien closed his eyes. Trust was not a luxury he could afford. Not now. not with Cedric's conspiracy crystallizing around him like ice forming on still water. Trust was the mechanism through which powerful men were destroyed, not by enemies, but by the single person they allowed past the perimeter. History was littered with empires that fell not from military defeat, but from one moment of misplaced faith. He would not become another cautionary tale. He would watch Serafina Vale with the same surgical attention he applied to every threat, and if she proved to be Cedric's weapon, he would remove her from the equation before she could fire. The following morning, Lucien entered the estate library at 6 o'clock and found Serafina already there. She sat at the long oak reading table with 7 leather-bound ledgers spread before her, a pot of tea growing cold at her elbow, and ink stains on her right index finger that told him she had been working since before dawn. Her hair was pulled back loosely. Her dress was the same green traveling outfit from her arrival. Either she had not brought alternatives, or she did not care enough about aristocratic appearance to change. Lucien catalogued every detail the way his military training demanded: entry points to the room, distance between them. The way morning light from the east windows caught the angles of her face and created shadows beneath cheekbones that were sharper than he had initially noticed. She did not look up. "You are in my library." "You gave me access to your library." She turned a page. "Third archive, financial records, nothing from the restricted section. I followed your instructions precisely." "I gave you access. I did not give you residency. If you wanted someone who operates on a schedule, you should have hired a clerk." She finally looked up. Her eyes moved across his face with that same diagnostic attention that unsettled him. "You did not sleep." It was not a question. "My sleeping patterns are not your concern. They are if they affect your judgment during a political crisis that will determine whether this estate survives the next 6 weeks." Lucien went still. 6 weeks. She had said 6 weeks. The exact timeline from Cedric's intercepted letter. The timeline that only Lucien, Graves, and the intended recipients of that letter were supposed to know. His voice dropped to a register that had preceded violence more than once in his life. "Where did you hear that number?" Serafina set down her pen. She read the shift in his body language the way a sailor reads a change in wind, immediately, instinctively, without needing to consult instruments. "I did not hear it anywhere. I calculated it." She gestured toward the open ledgers. "Your shipping contracts with the eastern ports renew in 6 weeks. 3 of those contracts require parliamentary endorsement to execute. If someone wanted to cripple Blackmoor's trade infrastructure, the window of maximum vulnerability is the 6-week period before renewal, when existing contracts have expired but new terms have not been ratified. Any competent financial strategist would identify that timeline within an hour of reviewing these records." Lucien stared at her. She had not received intelligence from Cedric. She had arrived at the same conclusion independently through pure financial analysis. The same timeline, the same vulnerability, derived not from espionage but from arithmetic. Something dangerous shifted inside his chest. Not suspicion retreating. Suspicion never retreated in Lucien Ravenscroft, but something adjacent to it, a grudging, involuntary recognition that the woman sitting before him possessed a mind operating at a frequency he had never encountered outside his own. He pulled a chair from the table and sat across from her. "Show me what you found." For the next 3 hours, Serafina dismantled Blackmoor's financial architecture in front of the man who had built it. She was methodical, ruthless in her analysis. She identified embezzlement patterns among 3 mid-level ministers that Lucien's own auditors had missed for years. She traced phantom expenses through supply chains with the patience of someone following a blood trail through snow. She isolated discrepancies in grain tax records that revealed not just Cedric's manipulation, but a deeper, older corruption embedded in the estate's infrastructure since before Lucien's inheritance. Lucien listened without interruption. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately decode. "You found errors in my system that my chief financial advisor failed to identify in a decade. Your chief financial advisor is either incompetent or complicit. I have not yet determined which. You suspect Harold Whitmore. I suspect the man responsible for auditing these records has a personal interest in ensuring certain discrepancies remain invisible." She paused. "Whitmore purchased a country estate in Sussex last year. A man on his salary does not purchase country estates." Lucien's jaw tightened. Whitmore. Harold Whitmore had served as Blackmoor's chief financial officer for 7 years. Quiet, reliable, invisible in the way that competent bureaucrats are invisible, performing essential functions without attracting attention. The perfect profile for a man selling information to an enemy. You are making a serious accusation. I am presenting data. The accusation makes itself. Lucien stood abruptly. The chair scraped against stone with a sound like a short scream. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her while something inside him recalibrated. Whitmore. If Whitmore was Cedric's source inside Blackmoor, it explained how the forged parliamentary documents had contained enough accurate data to appear credible. It explained how Cedric knew which trade routes to target. It explained a dozen small anomalies that Lucien had noticed over the past year, but attributed to bureaucratic inefficiency rather than deliberate betrayal. He had been betrayed before, multiple times, by allies, by relatives, by men who swore loyalty while sharpening knives behind their backs. Each betrayal had reinforced the same fundamental lesson that governed his existence. People fail you. Systems fail you. The only reliable architecture is the one you build inside yourself, the structure of absolute self-reliance that requires no external support and therefore cannot be compromised by external weakness. Gerald had been the single exception, and Gerald was dead. Your Grace, Seraphina's voice reached him from across the room. Not soft, not comforting, precise. If Whitmore is compromised, you have approximately 72 hours before Cedric realizes his courier was intercepted. After that, he will accelerate his timeline regardless of whether his alliance network is fully assembled. Lucien turned sharply. How do you know about the courier? I do not know about any courier. Her eyes held his without flinching. But a man like Cedric Ashbourne does not travel to an enemy's estate without establishing secure communications with his allies. And a man like you does not permit secure communications to pass through his territory without intercepting them. I am not guessing. I am observing the logical architecture of two intelligent men operating in opposition. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Lucien walked back to the table. He did not sit. He stood over her with his hands flat on the wood surface, close enough that she could see the individual threads of silver woven into his collar, and the precise musculature of forearms that had been shaped by years of riding and fighting rather than aristocratic leisure. You are either the most valuable person in this estate right now, he said quietly, or the most dangerous. I need to determine which. You will not determine it by standing over me. What will I determine it by? Time. She met his eyes. And whether you are capable of recognizing an ally when every instinct you possess is screaming that alliances are just betrayals that have not matured yet. Something cracked, not audibly, not physically. Something inside the fortified architecture of Lucien Ravenscroft's chest shifted 1 centimeter off its foundation, and the adjustment produced a sensation he had not experienced since he was 19 years old, standing in a field hospital, watching the only friend he had ever made die from wounds that should have been survivable. Fear, not tactical fear, not the calculated risk assessment that preceded military operations, the raw, mammalian, bone-deep terror of a man who recognizes that someone has found the gap in his armor and is standing inside it. He straightened. 72 hours. At most. Then we have work to do. He said we. The word left his mouth before his mind could intercept it, and the moment it existed in the air between them, Lucien understood that something fundamental had changed. Not his strategy, not his assessment of the threat landscape. Something beneath strategy, something structural. He had included her. For the first time in a decade, Duke Lucien Ravenscroft had used a plural pronoun that was not rhetorical. The following 48 hours unfolded with the compressed intensity of a military campaign. Lucien and Seraphina worked from the library in sessions that stretched past midnight and resumed before dawn. She deconstructed Blackmoor's financial vulnerabilities while he rebuilt defensive positions around each one. They argued constantly, not the polite disagreements of political negotiation, but the raw, combative exchanges of two minds testing each other's structural integrity. You are over-leveraged on the northern shipping routes. If Cedric disrupts even one major contract, the cascade effect reaches your domestic supply chains within weeks. Those routes generate 40% of Blackmoor's revenue. Reducing exposure means reducing power. Maintaining exposure to preserve the appearance of power while the actual infrastructure rots beneath it is not strength. It is vanity. Vanity. His voice dropped. You are calling the financial architecture I built over 10 years vanity. I am calling your refusal to adapt in the face of new threats exactly what it is. You built this system to withstand the enemies you had. You are now facing enemies your system was not designed for. And what would you redesign? Everything. The word hung between them like a blade suspended by a thread. Lucien stared at her. You do not lack ambition. I lack patience for men who would rather die defending a flawed system than survive by building a better one. He absorbed that the way he absorbed everything, structurally, measuring load-bearing capacity, calculating whether the foundation could support the weight of what she was proposing. The answer was uncomfortable. She was right. On the second evening, Lucien summoned Harold Whitmore to his study. The financial officer arrived at 9 o'clock, wearing his usual expression of mild professional competence, the face of a man who had spent 7 years being invisible and had no reason to believe that condition had changed. Lucien was seated behind his desk. A single candle burned on the surface. The rest of the room was dark. Sit down, Harold. Whitmore sat. Your Grace, is this regarding the quarterly reports? I can have the updated figures on your desk by Sussex. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Whitmore's expression flickered, 1 microsecond of disruption in the smooth surface of professional composure. Most men would have missed it. Lucien did not miss anything. Your Grace? You purchased a country estate in Sussex 14 months ago. 3 bedrooms, 12 acres. Valued at approximately £2,000. Lucien opened a drawer and placed a single document on the desk. Your salary as Blackmoor's chief financial officer is £320 per year. You have held the position for 7 years. Even assuming no personal expenses, which is mathematically absurd, your total earnings since appointment amount to £2,240, before taxes. Whitmore did not move. Would you like to explain the arithmetic, Harold? Because I have been reviewing it for the past 24 hours and the numbers do not reconcile. Silence. Whitmore's hands rested on his knees. Lucien watched those hands. Hands revealed what faces concealed. A man could discipline his expression through years of practice, but hands operated on a more primitive nervous system. They trembled. They clenched. They betrayed. Whitmore's right index finger twitched once. Your Grace, I assure you there is a perfectly reasonable— Do not! Lucien's voice cut the sentence in half like a closing door. Do not perform for me, Harold. I have watched men perform for 10 years. I know every variation. The concerned explanation, the wounded dignity, the reasonable justification. You're reaching for one of those right now, and I am telling you plainly. I will know which one it is before you finish the first sentence, and it will make this worse. Whitmore swallowed. How long has Cedric owned you? The question landed like a physical blow. Whitmore flinched, his entire body convulsing backward by half an inch, which in the grammar of involuntary movement was the equivalent of a full confession. I do not— 3 years? 4? Since before the Sussex purchase, or was that the payment? Your Grace, please, what did he ask for? Revenue data, shipping schedules, tenant agreements, all of it? Whitmore's composure collapsed. It did not happen gradually. It happened the way structural failures happen in architecture. The load exceeded capacity, and everything came down at once. He said he would protect my family. The words came out in a voice that no longer belonged to a financial officer. It belonged to a man whose internal walls had just failed. My daughter, she married a man with debts, terrible debts. Cedric said he would clear them, all of them. He said all he needed was information, just numbers, just data. He said no one would be harmed. No one would be harmed, Lucien repeated the words with a flatness that was more frightening than rage. You gave a political enemy the financial intelligence necessary to destroy this estate. You compromised the livelihoods of every tenant farmer, every merchant, every servant whose survival depends on Blackmoor's economic stability. And you did it because a man who builds conspiracies for entertainment told you no one would be harmed. Whitmore was shaking, visibly. The tremors moved through his shoulders and into his hands, and Lucy watched them with an expression that contained something more complex than anger. Recognition. Because Lucien understood Whitmore's calculation, not forgave it. Understood it. The arithmetic of a man who loved someone enough to sell his integrity, who measured loyalty against family and found that the institution he served weighed less than the people he cared about. It was the precise calculation Lucien had spent his entire life ensuring he would never be forced to make, because he had no one to love enough to be leveraged. Until now. The thought arrived uninvited, and Lucien crushed it immediately, grinding it beneath the weight of discipline the way a boot grinds a spark before it reaches dry timber. "You will continue in your position," Lucien said. Whitmore looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Your Grace?" "Cedric believes you are still his asset. That belief is now my asset. You will continue providing information to Lord Ashbourne. The information you provide will be what I give you, accurate enough to maintain credibility, calibrated enough to lead Cedric precisely where I need him to go." Whitmore stared at him. "You want me to be a double agent?" "I want you to understand something, Harold." Lucien leaned forward, and the candlelight carved his face into planes of shadow and cold precision. "You betrayed me. Under most circumstances, that conversation ends with you removed from this estate in a way that discourages future disloyalty. But I'm offering you something I have never offered anyone, a chance to repair what you broke. Not for my benefit, for your daughter's. Because if Cedric's conspiracy succeeds and Blackmoor falls, the protection he promised your family disappears the moment he no longer needs you. Men like Cedric do not honor debts, they collect them." Whitmore's breathing was ragged. "Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Then go back to your office. Resume your routine. And Harold." The financial officer paused at the door. "If you contact Cedric outside the channels I establish, I will know within the hour, and that conversation will not end with an offer." Whitmore left. Lucien extinguished the candle and sat in total darkness. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. His mind was already 3 moves ahead, restructuring the intelligence network around Whitmore's turned loyalty, calculating which data streams to corrupt and which to preserve. But beneath the machinery of strategic thought, something else was operating, something he could not diagram or control. Serafina had given him Whitmore. She had identified the traitor through pure analysis in less than 48 hours when his own security apparatus had failed for 7 years. Without her, Cedric's conspiracy would have reached execution phase before Lucien understood its full architecture. She had saved Blackmoor, and saving Blackmoor meant she had given Lucien the one thing he could never manufacture alone: time. The most valuable resource in any war. Time to prepare, time to counter, time to transform a defensive position into an offensive campaign. He owed her. Lucien Ravenscroft did not owe anyone. Debts created leverage. Leverage created vulnerability. Vulnerability created destruction. That chain of causation was as reliable as gravity and twice as merciless. Yet here he sat in darkness, owing something to a woman he had known for less than a week. And the most dangerous part was not the debt itself. It was that he did not want to repay it. He wanted to keep it. Because keeping the debt meant keeping her close. And keeping her close meant continuing to experience the only sensation that had penetrated his defenses since Gerald's death. The terrifying, addictive, structurally catastrophic recognition that another human being understood him. Not feared him, not obeyed him. Understood him. He sat in the darkness for a long time after that. 3 days later, Cedric Ashbourne requested a private audience. They met in the East Wing parlor, a room Lucien had specifically prepared with concealed observation points in the adjoining corridor where Graves monitored every word. Cedric arrived carrying 2 glasses of brandy. The gesture was deliberate, intimate, the choreography of a man who wanted to communicate that this conversation existed outside official channels. "Your Grace," Cedric handed him a glass. "I hope you will forgive the informality. I thought we might speak as men rather than politicians for once." Lucien accepted the glass but did not drink. "Men and politicians are the same thing, Cedric. The only difference is whether the knife is visible." Cedric smiled, sat in the chair opposite, crossed his legs with the casual elegance of someone who had been performing relaxation in hostile environments for decades. "I want to discuss Lady Vale." Lucien's expression did not change. Inside his chest, every nerve ending activated simultaneously. "What about her?" "She is remarkable, is she not? I have watched her during council sessions. The woman has a mind like a siege engine, why, slow to deploy but devastating once operational." He sipped his brandy. "I worry, though, that her influence on Blackmoor's operations may be premature." "Premature. You are a man of extraordinary discipline, Lucien. Your estate reflects that discipline. But discipline requires clarity of purpose. And clarity is the first casualty when a powerful man becomes captivated by an interesting woman." He paused. "Especially a woman whose family's financial desperation creates certain motivational ambiguities." Lucien listened to the architecture of the manipulation. It was elegant. Cedric was not attacking Serafina directly. He was planting doubt, suggesting that her presence compromised Lucien's judgment, framing concern as counsel, positioning himself as an ally who only wanted to protect the Duke from his own vulnerability. Turn her, and the Duke falls. This was the turn. Not recruitment, not bribery, not coercion. Cedric's strategy was surgical. Isolate Lucien from the one person who had strengthened his position and do it by weaponizing the Duke's own inability to trust. Because Cedric understood what Serafina understood, what Gerald had understood. Lucien's greatest vulnerability was not military or financial. It was the fortified solitude that he had mistaken for strength for 10 years. "Your concern is noted," Lucien said. "I mean it sincerely." "You have never meant anything sincerely in your life, Cedric, but the performance is exceptional. I will give you that." Cedric's smile did not waver, but his eyes changed. A subtle darkening, like clouds moving across a landscape, altering the quality of light without changing the terrain. "We all perform, Your Grace. The question is whether we perform for an audience or for ourselves." He finished his brandy, stood, adjusted his coat. "Think about what I said, about Lady Vale." He moved toward the door. "A man who cannot be broken by enemies can still be broken by affection. History is quite consistent on that point." He left. Lucien sat motionless for several minutes. Then he stood and walked to the library. Serafina was there. She was always there now, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, building the financial counteroffensive that was rapidly becoming the most sophisticated economic warfare campaign Blackmoor had ever mounted. She looked up when he entered. "Cedric just tried to turn me against you," he said. No preamble, no diplomatic framing. The raw statement delivered with the blunt force of a man who had decided, in that moment, walking the corridor between the parlor and the library, that whatever game was being played, he was done playing it alone. Serafina set down her pen. "What did he say?" Lucien told her. Every word, including the subtext, including the manipulation architecture. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "He is right about one thing," she said finally. "Which part?" "That you can be broken by affection." She looked at him with eyes that held no deception and no mercy. "That is not a weakness, Lucien. That is the only proof you have left that you are still human." He stood across from her in a library lit by dying afternoon light and felt the last structural beam inside his chest bend under a weight it was never designed to carry. "If I trust you," he said, and his voice was quiet enough that Graves, listening from the corridor, leaned forward to hear it, "and you betray me, it will not just destroy Blackmoor. It will destroy whatever part of me still remembers how to rebuild. I know. And you are asking me to take that risk." "No." She stood, crossed the distance between them until she was close enough that he could see the pulse point in her throat and the ink stain on her finger and the precise color of her eyes in the fading light. "I am telling you that you have already taken it. 3 days ago, when you said we instead of I. You just have not admitted it to yourself yet." Lucien looked at her. And for the first time in 10 years, the Duke of Blackmoor had absolutely no idea what to do next. That night, a second courier slipped past Blackmoor's outer walls carrying a message Lucien's men did not intercept. It reached London by dawn, and by the time the sun rose over the North Sea, 4 noble houses had received confirmation that Duke Lucien Ravenscroft had taken Seraphina Vale into his confidence, his war council, and his trust. Cedric Ashbourne read the report in his East Wing quarters and smiled. Then he drafted a single order to his allies. Accelerate everything. The Duke has given us exactly what we needed. The woman is inside. Now we use her to burn it all down. The second courier changed everything. Lucien did not learn about the breach for 3 days. 3 days during which he operated under the assumption that his intelligence perimeter remained intact, that every communication leaving Blackmoor passed through his surveillance apparatus, that the information environment inside his estate was still something he controlled. 3 days of miscalculation. 3 days that would cost him nearly everything. The first indication that something had shifted came not from Graves or from the intercepted correspondence network, but from a source Lucien had not anticipated. The servants. Specifically, the way they moved. Lucien had spent a decade reading the behavioral patterns of his household staff, the way a seismologist reads tremor data, subtle shifts in routine that preceded larger disruptions, servants who avoided certain corridors, maids who no longer made eye contact with specific guests, kitchen staff whose conversations died with particular abruptness when certain names were mentioned. On the morning of the 4th day after Cedric's private audience, Lucien walked through the East Wing and noticed that 2 chambermaids assigned to Ashbourne's quarters had been replaced. Not reassigned. Replaced. By women he did not recognize. He found Graves in the intelligence room beneath the main hall, who authorized new staff in the East Wing. Graves looked up from a cipher table with the expression of a man who had been trying to locate a specific piece of information for hours and had just been told it was standing directly behind him. I did not authorize any staffing changes. Then who did? Mrs. Harding manages household assignments. She reports to Harold Whitmore. The name landed in the room like a dropped blade. Graves went very still. Pull every communication log from Whitmore's office for the past 72 hours, Lucien said. Every piece of paper, every visitor, every message that passed through his hands. Your Grace, we turned Whitmore. He is operating under our control. We turned Whitmore 4 days ago. He has had 4 days to decide whether our leverage outweighs Cedric's. That is 4 days more than most men need to calculate where their survival odds are better. Lucien's voice carried the flat precision of a man whose intuition was screaming and whose discipline required verification before action. Pull the logs, now. Graves moved. What the logs revealed arrived in Lucien's study 2 hours later in the form of 3 pages of decoded communications that Malcolm Graves placed on the desk with hands that, for the first time in Lucien's memory, were not entirely steady. Whitmore had not betrayed them, not directly. What Whitmore had done was worse. He had followed Lucien's instructions precisely, feeding Cedric calibrated misinformation through the established channels. But he had failed to account for the fact that Cedric Ashbourne did not rely on a single intelligent source. The new chambermaids in the East Wing were Cedric's people, placed through a domestic staffing agency in York that Whitmore's office processed routinely. The authorization paperwork was buried inside a batch of 18 routine personnel transfers that Whitmore had signed without reading individually because he was focused entirely on the intelligence operation Lucien had assigned him. A competent man, following orders, missing the peripheral threat because his attention had been deliberately narrowed. Cedric had not outmaneuvered Lucien's strategy. He had outmaneuvered Lucien's instrument, and through those 2 chambermaids, Cedric had gained access to something that no amount of financial data or shipping manifests could provide. He had gained access to the domestic rhythms of Blackmoor Keep itself. Which rooms Lucien visited and when, which corridors he walked at night, where he spent his evenings, and with whom. The chambermaids reported directly to Ashbourne's personal secretary, Graves said. We intercepted a summary dispatch this morning. It details your movements for the past 6 days. Your meetings with Lady Vale, the duration of those meetings, the hours, the locations. Lucien read the dispatch. It was clinical, precise. The Duke meets with Lady Vale in the library nightly. Average duration 4 hours. Private conversation. No advisors present. No guards inside the room. The Duke's behavioral patterns have altered measurably since Lady Vale's arrival. He eats less. He sleeps later. He visits Gerald Hastings' grave twice daily instead of the previous once weekly. That last detail hit Lucien in the sternum like a closed fist. Someone had been watching him visit Gerald's grave. Someone had counted the frequency. Someone had noted the change and transmitted it to Cedric Ashbourne as evidence of emotional vulnerability. The most private act remaining in his life, standing over the grave of the only man who had ever truly known him, had been quantified, catalogued, and delivered to his enemy as tactical intelligence. Lucien set the dispatch down. His breathing was controlled. His posture was rigid. His face displayed nothing. But inside the fortified architecture of his chest, something was burning. Not rage. Something older. Something that predated his inheritance and his military career and his entire adult identity. The primal, wordless fury of an animal that has discovered its den has been breached while it was sleeping. Where is Cedric now? In the East Wing. He has a meeting scheduled with 3 parliamentary observers this afternoon. Cancel it. Your Grace? Cancel every meeting on Cedric's schedule. Revoke his parliamentary credentials for the estate. I want him confined to his quarters under guard within the hour. Graves hesitated. Not from disagreement. From the recognition that the order Lucien had just given would trigger a political crisis of enormous magnitude. Confining a parliamentary delegation leader inside your estate without formal charges will be interpreted as imprisonment. The House of Lords will receive a detailed report of Cedric Ashbourne's espionage operations against a sitting duke within 24 hours, along with evidence of forged parliamentary documents, bribed witnesses, and the placement of intelligence operatives inside my domestic staff. Lucien's voice dropped to the specific register that men who had served him for years recognized as the sound of a decision that would not be reversed. I am done defending, Malcolm. This ends now. Graves nodded once and left. Lucien sat alone for exactly 4 minutes. Then he went to find Serafina. She was not in the library. The realization produced an immediate physiological response, a spike of adrenaline that accelerated his pulse before his conscious mind could override it. He checked the dining hall, the east corridor, the garden terrace where she sometimes walked when the wind died down enough to make the cliffs bearable. She was not there. He found a footman in the main corridor. Lady Vale? Where is she? The footman's face told him something was wrong before the words did. The particular pallor, the avoidance of direct eye contact, the micro-hesitation of a servant who possesses information his employer will not want to receive. Lady Vale left the estate approximately 2 hours ago, Your Grace. She departed with Viscount Vale in Lord Ashbourne's secondary carriage. The world did not stop. The corridor did not darken. The stone walls did not close in. Those were the reactions of lesser men in moments of crisis. Theatrical, undisciplined, wasteful. What happened inside Lucien Ravenscroft was structural. The load-bearing wall that had bent 3 days ago in the library, when Serafina stood close enough for him to see the pulse in her throat, that wall now cracked. Not collapsed. Cracked. And through the crack poured every contingency his mind could generate in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She left with Cedric's carriage. She left voluntarily. She left without telling him. Where did the carriage go? South Road, Your Grace, toward York. Lucien turned on his heel and walked to the intelligence room with strides that made every servant in the corridor press themselves against the walls. Graves was already there, coordinating the operation to confine Cedric. Stop. Graves looked up. Serafina Vale left Blackmoor 2 hours ago in Ashbourne's carriage. The information landed on Graves like a physical weight. Lucien watched his advisor process it, watched the calculations cascade through the man's expression as each implication triggered the next. If Lady Vale has defected to Ashbourne, she has access to everything. Lucien's voice was ice over moving water, calm surface, lethal current. Every financial vulnerability she identified, every defensive position we restructured, Whitmore's turned status, the intercepted courier, the misinformation channels. She knows the complete architecture of our counteroffensive because I gave it to her. He had given it to her, personally. During those late-night sessions in the library where he had allowed himself to believe, for the first time in a decade, that another human being could be trusted with the internal machinery of his survival. We. The word he had used 3 days ago echoed inside his skull with the percussive cruelty of a bell that would not stop ringing. I want riders on the South Road within 15 minutes, Lucien said. Track the carriage. Do not engage. I need to know where she goes. And Lord Ashbourne? Confine him. Original plan. If Serafina has defected, Cedric is no longer the primary threat. She is. But Cedric inside my walls while his conspiracy accelerates is a liability I will not carry. Graves moved with the focused velocity of a man who understood that the next several hours would determine whether Blackmoor Keep survived as an institution. Lucien stood alone in the intelligence room, surrounded by maps and cipher tables and the accumulated apparatus of a surveillance operation that had just failed at its single most critical junction. He looked down at his hands. They were steady. Of course they were steady. Lucien Ravenscroft's hands had been steady when he buried his father. Steady when he fought 3 armed men in a Manchester warehouse during the Consolidation Wars. Steady when he signed execution orders for traitors who had tried to assassinate him in his own bedroom. Steady hands were not evidence of calm. They were evidence of a man whose body had been trained to perform stability regardless of what was happening inside it. And what was happening inside it was demolition. Not the controlled demolition of a strategist adapting to new information. The uncontrolled collapse of a man who had broken his own fundamental rule. The rule that had kept him alive, kept Blackmoor standing, kept the Northern Territories functioning under his authority for 10 years. Trust no one. He had trusted her. He had trusted her with the financial architecture of his estate, the identity of his turned agent, the complete tactical landscape of his war with Cedric Ashbourne. He had trusted her because she was brilliant, and because she was unafraid, and because when she looked at him she saw something other than the weapon the world had forced him to become. And now she was gone. In Cedric's carriage, toward York, where 4 noble houses waited to receive whatever intelligence she carried. Lucien placed both hands on the map table and leaned forward until his arms bore his full weight. His breathing was controlled. His jaw was locked. His eyes were closed. Behind the darkness of his eyelids, a single thought formed with the absolute clarity of a mathematical proof. This is what trust costs. 2 hours later, the riders returned. Lucien was in his study. He had not moved, had not eaten, had not spoken to anyone since dispatching the tracking party. The candles were burning low, and the North Sea was performing its eternal assault on the cliffs below, and the room smelled of cold stone and old paper and the particular absence of warmth that defined Blackmoor Keep. Captain Drake entered without knocking. Another breach of protocol that signaled emergency. "We found the carriage." "Where?" "Halstead Manor, 8 miles south. It is a property owned by Lord Montclair." Montclair. One of the 4 houses on Cedric's conspiracy list. One of the 4 families whose parliamentary votes could destroy Lucien's authority. Was she inside? She entered the manor approximately 40 minutes before we arrived. Viscount Vale was with her. They were received by Lord Montclair personally. Lucien absorbed the information the way a body absorbs a blade, feeling it enter, feeling it settle against bone, registering the damage without permitting the pain to reach his face. She had gone to Montclair. She had gone voluntarily, in Cedric's carriage, to the estate of one of Cedric's co-conspirators. "Pull our men back to the perimeter," Lucien said. "Maintain surveillance, but do not approach the manor." Drake hesitated. "Your Grace, there is something else." Lucien waited. "We intercepted a rider leaving Halstead Manor carrying correspondence. 4 identical sealed letters addressed to Pemberton, Carrick, Haldane, and a 4th party we could not immediately identify.
Basti.
4 letters. 4 houses. The same distribution pattern as Cedric's original conspiracy communication. Lucien closed his eyes. "Open them." Drake placed the intercepted letters on the desk. Lucien broke the first seal and read the contents, then the second, then the third, then the 4th. Each letter was identical. Each letter was written in Serafina's handwriting. Each letter contained a complete and devastatingly accurate summary of Blackmoor's financial vulnerabilities, every weakness she had identified during her time in the library, every defensive restructuring she and Lucien had planned together, every detail of the counteroffensive that represented Blackmoor's only strategic advantage against Cedric's conspiracy. The letters were signed Lady Seraphina Vale, with a single sentence beneath the signature that Lucien read 7 times before the words stopped blurring. The Duke's trust has been secured. His defenses are open. Move now while the architecture is exposed. Lucien set the letters down. He sat very still for a long time. Outside, the North Sea continued its work against the cliffs. Patient, relentless, indifferent to the damage it produced. The sound entered through the window and filled the study with a rhythm that Lucien had associated with permanence his entire life, the one constant in an existence defined by betrayal and adaptation and the systematic elimination of everything soft enough to be wounded. He had let her in, not into the estate, not into the library, not into the war council. He had led her into the one place that mattered, the place behind his ribs where the last remnant of something human had survived a decade of fortification, the place where Gerald's memory lived, the place where a younger version of himself, 19, bleeding, watching his friend die in a field hospital, had been sealed away like a document too valuable to display and too dangerous to destroy. She had found that place, and she had mapped it for his enemies. Lucien stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkness and the sea and the absolute nothing that stretched beyond the cliffs. A man who cannot be broken by enemies can still be broken by affection. Cedric's words, spoken in the parlor, delivered as a warning that was actually a prophecy. And the prophecy had come true. But here was the thing about Lucien Ravenscroft that Cedric Ashbourne and Seraphina Vale and every noble house in England had fundamentally miscalculated. Broken was not the same as finished. Broken was a structural condition. It described damage. It did not describe capacity. A broken wall could still bear weight if the man standing behind it understood load distribution. A broken system could still function if the operator was willing to strip it down to its most essential components and rebuild from the foundation. Lucien had rebuilt before. He had rebuilt after his father's death, when the estate was poisoned by debt and corruption. He had rebuilt after the consolidation wars, when rival houses burned his supply chains and murdered his allies. He had rebuilt after every betrayal, every assassination attempt, every political assault that was supposed to be the one that finally ended the Ravenscroft dynasty. He could rebuild again, but not as the same man. That was the part most people never understood about survival. They imagined it as endurance, holding a fixed position against mounting pressure until the pressure relented. But real survival, the kind that operated at the level of empires and dynasties and men who shaped the direction of history, was not endurance. It was mutation. The thing that survives is never the thing that entered the fire. It is the thing that emerged from it, altered, restructured, carrying the memory of heat inside its architecture like carbon compressed into diamond, harder than the original material, more dangerous, and fundamentally transformed. Lucien turned from the window. Graves. The advisor appeared within minutes. He had been waiting in the corridor. Of course he had. Malcolm Graves always waited in corridors during crises. It was where intelligence lived, in the spaces between rooms, in the gaps between official conversations, in the silences that powerful men thought were private. Your orders, Your Grace. Send riders to Pemberton, Carrick, and Haldane. Not with threats, with invitations. I want the heads of those 3 houses inside Blackmoor Keep within 48 hours. Graves processed the instruction. You intend to negotiate with Cedric's allies. I intend to make Cedric's allies my allies. They have received Lady Vale's intelligence. They know every vulnerability in our defensive architecture. Yes, which means they also know exactly how dangerous Blackmoor is when fully exposed. Lucien's voice carried something new, not the cold precision of a man executing a strategy, something rawer. Something that had been forged in the last 3 hours of silence and darkness and the systematic dismantling of every emotional structure he had allowed Seraphina Vale to build inside him. A man who shows you his weaknesses voluntarily is not vulnerable. He is communicating that he is strong enough to survive the exposure. That is a message Cedric's allies will understand because they are politicians, and politicians calculate risk before they calculate loyalty. And Cedric himself? Confined, under guard, I will deal with him after the alliance structure is rebuilt. And Lady Vale? Lucien paused. The pause lasted 3 seconds, an eternity in the behavioral grammar of a man who typically processed decisions at mechanical speed. Lady Vale made her choice. When this is over, she will face the consequences of that choice. But not now. Now she is irrelevant to the tactical problem. The word irrelevant came out clean, smooth, without tremor or hesitation. Graves did not believe it for 1 second, but Malcolm Graves had not survived 20 years in political intelligence by identifying emotions out loud. I will dispatch the writers immediately. One more thing. Lucien opened a drawer and removed a sealed document. This is the complete financial restructuring plan Serafina and I developed. Every defensive position, every contingency, every vulnerability. Graves stared. Your Grace, that document is compromised. She delivered its contents to Montclair hours ago, which means the version our enemies possess is the current architecture. He placed the document on the desk. So we build a new one. In 48 hours. In 48 hours. Your Grace, restructuring an estate's entire financial defense architecture in 48 hours is what needs to happen. Lucien looked at his advisor with eyes that had changed since that morning. Something behind them had been removed, not destroyed, removed the way a surgeon removes damaged tissue to prevent infection from spreading. What remained was cleaner, colder, more efficient. Everything she identified was real. Every vulnerability existed before she arrived, and it will exist after she is gone. The question is not whether we are exposed. The question is whether we can build a new architecture fast enough that the exposure becomes a trap instead of a weakness. Graves studied the Duke's face for a long moment. You want to use her intelligence against them. I want to let them believe they know our weaknesses. Then I want to move the walls while they are still aiming at where the walls used to be. Something shifted in Graves' expression. Not admiration exactly. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man who had watched Lucien Ravenscroft adapt to catastrophic setbacks before, and understood that the most dangerous version of the Duke was not the one operating from strength. It was the one operating from wreckage. I will assemble the financial team, Graves said. No team. You and me. No one else touches this architecture. No advisors, no ministers, no one whose loyalty has not been tested by decades of shared survival. Just the two of us rebuilding an estate's entire defensive structure in 48 hours. Gerald used to say that empires are not built by committees. Lucien's jaw tightened at the name. He was right. Committees distribute responsibility. Responsibility without concentration produces mediocrity. And mediocrity, Malcolm, is what gets kingdoms destroyed. Graves removed his spectacles, cleaned them, replaced them. The ritual was his version of a deep breath, the mechanical action that preceded total commitment. Then we had better start now. They worked through the night. They worked through the following day. They rebuilt Blackmoor's financial architecture from the foundation up, restructuring trade routes, repositioning capital reserves, creating false vulnerability points designed to attract precisely the kind of attack Cedric's conspiracy was engineered to execute. Every defensive position Serafina had helped construct was dismantled and rebuilt 6 inches to the left, 6 inches to the right, deep enough to look identical from the outside, but different enough to absorb the assault without structural failure. Lucien did not sleep. He did not eat. He operated on the particular fuel that had sustained him through every crisis of his adult life, the cold, clarified energy of a man who had lost something valuable and converted the loss into velocity. At 3 a.m. on the second night, Graves fell asleep at the map table. Lucien covered him with a coat and continued working alone. At dawn, a rider arrived from the south. Lucien met him in the courtyard. The air was freezing. His breath produced clouds of vapor that dissolved instantly in the coastal wind. His eyes were red-rimmed from 40 hours without sleep, but his hands were steady and his voice was precise. Report. Lord Pemberton has accepted your invitation. He arrives tomorrow evening. Lord Carrick sends his regrets, but his son and heir will attend in his place. Lord Haldane. The writer paused. Lord Haldane requests clarification on the nature of the meeting. Tell Haldane that the nature of the meeting is survival. his survival specifically, and tell him that if he requires additional clarification, he should ask Cedric Ashbourne, who will be in no position to provide it by the time Haldane finishes reading tomorrow's parliamentary dispatches. Well, the writer departed. Lucien stood in the courtyard and watched the sun climb above the North Sea. The light hit Blackmoor's granite walls and turned them gold for exactly 11 minutes. Lucien knew, because he had counted those minutes every morning since childhood. 11 minutes of warmth before the stone returned to its natural gray. 11 minutes during which the fortress almost looked like a place where something other than power and discipline might survive. He thought about Serafina, not with longing, not with rage, with the precise surgical attention of a man cataloging the exact location and depth of a wound so that he could ensure it never opened again. She had been right about him. Every word, his inability to trust, his structural loneliness. The way control had become a substitute for connection until the substitute consumed the original. She had been right about all of it, and she had used every piece of that understanding to destroy him. The cruelest betrayals are never committed by enemies. Enemies attack what you protect. But the people you trust, the people you let pass the walls, the people who sit with you in candlelit libraries and dismantle your defenses with honesty and intelligence and the terrifying intimacy of being truly seen, those people do not attack what you protect. They attack what you are. Lucien breathed in cold, salt air until his lungs ached. Then he turned away from the sunrise and walked back into Blackmoor Keep. There was work to do. And the man who walked through those gates was not the man who had stood in the library 4 days ago, heart cracking, saying "we" to a woman who was already planning how to burn everything that word represented. That man was gone. The man who replaced him was something England had not yet encountered. And by the time the noble houses arrived at Blackmoor Keep to decide the fate of the Northern Territories, every single one of them would understand that Duke Lucien Ravenscroft had not been broken by Serafina Vale's betrayal. He had been unleashed by it. Lord Pemberton arrived first. His carriage crossed Blackmoor's outer perimeter at 6:30 on a Thursday evening, so cold the horse's breath looked like cannon smoke against the darkening sky. Pemberton was 61 years old, built like a cathedral door, with white side whiskers and hands that still carried the calluses of a man who had managed working estates before inheriting parliamentary influence. He was the most pragmatic of Cedric's allies, a man who followed power the way water follows gravity, not from loyalty, but from the physics of self-preservation. Lucien met him in the courtyard alone. No servants, no advisors, no ceremonial reception, just the Duke standing in the freezing wind with his military coat open and his hands uncovered, communicating through every physical detail that formality was a luxury this meeting would not observe. Pemberton descended from his carriage and studied Lucien's face the way a farmer studies weather before deciding whether to bring livestock inside. "You look terrible," Pemberton said. "You look nervous," Lucien answered. "Which of us should be more concerned?" Pemberton almost smiled. "I received your invitation. I also received Lady Vale's correspondence 3 days ago. You should know that before we begin." "I know what you received. I know what it contained. I know it gave you a detailed map of every vulnerability inside this estate." Lucien stepped forward. "And I know you came anyway, which means you have already calculated that whatever Cedric Ashbourne promised you is worth less than whatever I am about to offer." Pemberton's expression shifted, not dramatically. A slight adjustment around the eyes that told Lucien the calculation was accurate. "What are you offering?" "Walk with me." They entered Blackmoor through the side entrance, the corridor that bypassed the main hall and led directly to the war chamber beneath the keep. Lucien had chosen the route deliberately. No witnesses, no interceptable conversation, and the destination itself was a message. The war chamber was where Ravenscroft rulers had planned military campaigns for 3 centuries. Bringing Pemberton there communicated that this negotiation existed at the level of warfare, not politics. Inside the chamber, maps covered the walls. The rebuilt financial architecture, 48 hours of sleepless work compressed into tactical overlays, filled every available surface. Lucien had left nothing hidden. Every defensive position, every trade route, every capital reserve and contingency fund and economic pressure point was displayed openly. Pemberton scanned the room and his composure cracked slightly. You are showing me everything. Everything. After what Lady Vale did with the last set of intelligence you shared. Lady Vale shared outdated information. What you are looking at is the current architecture, built in the last 48 hours. Every position she compromised has been restructured. Every vulnerability she identified has been reinforced or relocated. Lucien stood at the head of the table. I am showing you this because I need you to understand two things simultaneously. First, that Cedric's conspiracy is operating on intelligence that is no longer accurate. Second, that I am willing to trust you with the accurate version. Why? Because you are a pragmatist, Pemberton. You joined Cedric's alliance because the mathematics favored his position. I am here to change the mathematics. For the next 90 minutes, Lucien dismantled Cedric Ashbourne's conspiracy in front of the man who was supposed to be part of it. He presented evidence of the forged parliamentary documents. He revealed Cedric's espionage operations inside Blackmoor. He detailed the financial manipulation schemes that Cedric had orchestrated not just against Lucien, but against every allied house, skimming resources, redirecting trade profits, using the conspiracy itself as a mechanism for concentrating wealth inside Ashbourne's personal holdings at the expense of every partner involved. Cedric had not built an alliance. He had built a parasitic structure designed to feed on its own members while directing their collective aggression toward Blackmoor. Pemberton listened without interruption. His face cycled through several distinct phases: skepticism, calculation, anger, and finally the cold clarity of a man who has just discovered he was not a partner in a conspiracy, but a resource being consumed by one. The shipping contracts, Pemberton said slowly. Cedric told us those revenues would be redistributed among allied houses after Blackmoor's authority was revoked. Show me the document where that redistribution was formalized. Silence. There is no document, Pemberton said. There is no document because the redistribution was never intended to occur. Cedric's financial projections route all seized revenue through a holding structure registered in his wife's maiden name. Your house receives a consulting fee, a fraction. The rest consolidates under Ashbourne control. Pemberton stood. His chair scraped against the stone floor and the sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. That son of a Sit down! Pemberton sat. Not because Lucien's voice carried authority, though it did, because the man's legs had briefly refused to support the weight of what he had just learned. I am not asking for your loyalty, Lucien said. Loyalty is an emotional currency, and I no longer trade in emotions. I am asking for your rational self-interest. Cedric's conspiracy benefits Cedric. My counter-proposal benefits every house at this table. What counter-proposal? Lucien laid out the restructured trade agreements he and Graves had built during their 48-hour marathon. Revenue sharing, territorial protections, parliamentary voting alignments that strengthen Northern representation without concentrating authority in any single house. It was not generous. Lucien Ravenscroft did not do generous, but it was fair. Mathematically, structurally, demonstrably fair. Every number could be verified. Every projection could be audited. Every commitment was formalized in language so precise that even a hostile attorney could not find ambiguity. Pemberton read the documents for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up. Carrick's son arrives tomorrow? Tonight. His carriage was spotted on the North Road an hour ago. And Haldane? Haldane has not confirmed. Pemberton folded his hands on the table. Haldane will confirm. I will make certain of it. The man has 4 daughters and not a single one married well. He needs Northern trade access more than he needs Cedric Ashbourne's promises. Lucien felt something recalibrate inside his tactical assessment. Not trust. He was done with trust as an operating principle, but recognition. The recognition that Pemberton had just committed to an active role in rebuilding the alliance structure. Not as a subordinate, not as a conscript, but as a man whose self-interest had been accurately identified and properly engaged. This was how empires actually functioned. Not through affection, not through loyalty, through the precise alignment of rational interests among men who understood that cooperation was a survival mechanism and sentimentality was a vulnerability. Serafina had told him that his inability to trust was his greatest weakness. She was wrong. His greatest weakness had been trusting her. His greatest strength, the one that had built Blackmoor and sustained it through a decade of warfare, was his ability to build functional structures that did not require trust to operate. Structures held together by mathematics and mutual benefit and the cold recognition that betrayal was economically irrational when the alternative was profitable. He had forgotten that. She had made him forget it. The library and the candlelight and the way she looked at him with those diagnostic eyes had made him believe that human connection could replace structural engineering as the foundation of power. It could not. It never could. Young Lord Carrick arrived at 11 that evening, a 26-year-old with his father's sharp political instincts and none of his caution. He absorbed Lucien Ravenscroft's presentation in half the time Pemberton required and committed with a handshake before midnight. Haldane confirmed by courier the following morning exactly as Pemberton predicted. Within 72 hours of Seraphina's betrayal, Lucien had turned 3 of Cedric's 4 allied houses. The conspiracy's skeleton was collapsing inward. On the 4th morning, Lucien went to Cedric. The East Wing quarters had been converted into a comfortable prison, guards at every door, windows locked, Cedric's personal staff removed and replaced with Blackmoor operatives. The rooms were warm, well-furnished, stocked with food and brandy. Lucien was not cruel. Cruelty was inefficient, but the comfort was itself a message. It communicated that Cedric's confinement was not a panicked reaction, but a controlled operation executed by a man with the resources to imprison enemies in luxury. Cedric was standing at the window when Lucien entered. He turned with the particular composure of a man who had spent 4 days preparing for this conversation. "Lucien," he gestured at the room, "your hospitality is excessive. Your conspiracy is finished." Cedric's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation that lasted approximately 2 seconds before the smooth surface reconstituted itself. "That is a dramatic statement. Pemberton is mine. Carrick is mine. Haldane arrives tomorrow. Your parliamentary quorum no longer exists. Your financial projections were exposed to every allied house 48 hours ago, and the intelligence Lady Vale delivered to Montclair is worthless, because every position she documented has been rebuilt." Lucien watched the information land. Cedric was good, perhaps the best political operator Lucien had ever encountered, but even the best operators have tells. Involuntary signals that emerge when the conscious mind is processing faster than the body can mask. Cedric's tell was in his breathing, a slight acceleration, 2 additional breaths per minute above his baseline, invisible to anyone who had not been counting. Lucien had been counting. "You turned my allies in 4 days," Cedric said. "I showed them the numbers, your numbers, the ones that prove you were stealing from every house in your own coalition." Cedric was quiet for a moment. Then he did something Lucien did not anticipate. He laughed. Not the performative laugh from the council dinner. A genuine laugh. The laugh of a man who recognizes that he has been outplayed by a superior opponent and possesses enough ego to find it entertaining rather than devastating. "I underestimated you. You underestimated the mathematics. I am merely the operator." "No, I underestimated something specific." Cedric sat in the armchair beside the window. "I believed that breaking your trust would break your effectiveness. I believed that Seraphina would cripple you emotionally, and the emotional damage would translate into strategic paralysis." He looked at Lucien with something approaching genuine respect. "I was wrong. You did not collapse. You accelerated." Lucien's jaw tightened at her name, a muscular response he could not entirely suppress. "Is that what she was? A weapon designed to cripple me emotionally?" "She was an opportunity I exploited. The woman's brilliance was real. Her analysis was genuine. I simply ensured her father's desperation was directed toward my interests at the critical moment." Her father. "Viscount Vale's debts are not merely financial, Lucien. 3 months ago, I purchased every outstanding obligation the Vale family carries. Every mortgage, every personal loan, every gambling debt Aldrich Vale accumulated during his spectacular decline." Cedric's voice carried the casual precision of a man describing a chess move rather than the destruction of a human life. "When I informed the Viscount that his daughter could either cooperate with my requirements or watch her father imprisoned for debt, real imprisonment, not this comfortable arrangement, the mathematics became quite straightforward." Something detonated inside Lucien's chest. Not rage, not the familiar tactical anger that he had channeled into strategy for a decade. Something more fundamental. Something that originated in the same buried place where Gerald's memory lived, and where the 19-year-old version of himself had been sealed away after watching his friend die. Serafina had not betrayed him. She had been coerced. Her father's freedom, his survival, had been leveraged against her by a man who understood that the most effective weapon against a woman of exceptional moral courage was not threatening her directly, but threatening someone she could not abandon. The letters, the intelligence, the departure in Cedric's carriage, all of it performed under duress by a woman whose choice was not between loyalty and betrayal, but between two different kinds of destruction. Betray Lucien and preserve her father. Protect Lucien and condemn the man who raised her. Cedric had not turned Serafina against Lucien. He had placed her in a position where every possible action produced devastation and then harvested the result. Lucien looked at Cedric Ashbourne and felt something he had not experienced since the Consolidation Wars. The desire to kill a man with his hands, not strategically, not as a calculated consequence. The raw, ancestral, pre-rational desire to close the distance between them and end the threat permanently through the most direct mechanism available. His hands began to shake. For the first time in 10 years, Lucien Ravenscroft's hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists and held them at his sides and controlled his breathing with the mechanical discipline of a man whose body was trying to override his mind, and whose mind was refusing to relinquish command. Where is she now? Montclair's estate, under comfortable supervision. The Viscount is with her. Comfortable supervision. The words came out through clenched teeth. You imprisoned a woman in a country manor and called it supervision. I provided incentive for cooperation and a pleasant environment in which to cooperate. The distinction matters, Lucien. In court, in parliament, in the narrative I have been constructing for the past several months. The narrative is over. Is it? Cedric leaned forward slightly. You have turned my parliamentary allies. Impressive. But Montclair remains loyal to me, and Montclair controls the eastern trade corridor that connects Blackmoor's shipping routes to London markets. Without that corridor, your rebuilt financial architecture is a beautiful machine with no fuel supply. Lucien processed the implication at full speed. Cedric was right. The Eastern Corridor was the critical link in Blackmoor's trade infrastructure. Every restructured position, every defensive contingency, every economic pressure point in the rebuilt architecture depended on that corridor remaining open. Pemberton and Carrick and Haldane controlled parliamentary votes. Montclair controlled logistics. Cedric had lost his political alliance, but he still held the economic choke point, and Serafina was inside it. You want to negotiate, Lucien said. I want to survive, which, as you well know, is the most honest motivation anyone in this game ever has. Cedric stood. Here is what I propose. Montclair releases the Eastern Corridor. I withdraw all parliamentary actions against Blackmoor. Lady Vale and her father are returned to your estate unharmed. In exchange, I retain my lands, my titles, and my freedom. You attempted to destroy my estate, my authority, and my life, and you want to walk away intact. I want to walk away alive. There is a meaningful difference. Cedric's mask slipped for one fraction of a second, and beneath it Lucien saw something he had never seen in the man before. Fear. Genuine, unperformable fear. The kind that lives in the bones and cannot be disguised by decades of political training. You have won, Lucien. Every strategic objective I pursued has been neutralized. But victory and annihilation are not the same thing, and a duke who annihilates a defeated enemy creates more fear than he can sustain. You are lecturing me about sustainable fear. I am reminding you that the man who showed Pemberton mercy and mathematics instead of punishment and threats is the man who rebuilt his alliance in 4 days. That man is more dangerous than the one who destroys enemies, because that man creates structures, and structures outlast vengeance. Lucien stared at him. He hated that Cedric was right, hated it with a visceral intensity that burned along his ribs and tightened his throat. Hated it because the rational part of his mind, the part that had rebuilt Blackmoor's defenses in 48 hours and turned 3 enemy houses in 4 days, recognized the strategic validity of what his enemy was proposing. Destroying Cedric would feel like justice. Containing Cedric would function like power. and Lucien had spent his entire life choosing function over feeling. But there was a variable in this equation that mathematics could not resolve. Serafina. She was inside Montclair's estate, under Cedric's control. And every hour she remained there was an hour during which Lucien operated with a fracture in his concentration that no amount of discipline could fully suppress. He could rebuild financial architectures in 48 hours. He could turn enemy alliances in 4 days. He could negotiate with predators and calculate odds and execute strategies with mechanical precision. But he could not stop thinking about her, not about the betrayal, not about the letters or the intelligence she had delivered to his enemies, about her. The woman who sat in his library and dismantled his defenses with honesty. The woman who looked at him and saw something other than a weapon. The woman who told him that his inability to trust was not a weakness, but the only proof he had left that he was still human. She had said that knowing she was being watched, knowing that every word she spoke might be her last act of genuine honesty before Cedric's leverage closed around her throat like a fist. She had told him the truth while preparing to be forced into a lie. And that single act, that desperate, impossible, unbearably courageous act of giving him real honesty while standing on the edge of coerced betrayal, was the most human thing anyone had done for Lucien Ravenscroft since Gerald Hastings placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he was more than what the world had made him. "I will consider your terms," Lucien said. Cedric nodded. Lucien left the East Wing and walked through Blackmoor's corridors with the measured stride of a man holding a civil war inside his own chest. In the intelligence room, Graves waited. "Prepare a strike force," Lucien said. 12 men, Drake leads, full tactical loadout." Graves stared. "Target?" "Halstead Manor." "Your Grace, an armed operation against Montclair's estate is an act of— I am aware of what it is." Cedric offered terms, rational terms, terms that preserve Blackmoor's strategic position without— Cedric offered terms that leave Serafina inside his control structure until I comply. Every hour she remains at Montclair is an hour during which she functions as leverage. I do not negotiate under leverage. Lucien turned to face Graves directly. "She did not betray me, Malcolm. She was coerced. Cedric purchased her father's debts and used them to force her cooperation. Every piece of intelligence she delivered was extracted under duress." Graves was very still. "That changes the situation." "It changes everything." Graves removed his spectacles, cleaned them, replaced them. 12 men is not enough for a fortified manor. 12 men is enough if the manor does not know we are coming. Drake's team enters through the service corridors on the east side. Montclair's guard complement is domestic security, not military. 20 men at most, trained for estate protection, not tactical assault. And if Montclair responds with force, then Montclair learns the difference between a political adversary and a military one. Graves studied him for a long moment. "You are not doing this for strategic reasons. I am doing this because a woman who tried to save me was punished for it, and because the man who punished her is sitting in my East Wing drinking my brandy while she remains imprisoned in his ally's house." Lucien's voice carried something that Graves had never heard in it before. Not cold precision, not calculated authority. Heat. The dangerous, unstable heat of a man whose strategic architecture and emotional infrastructure had finally fused into a single operating system. "Prepare the team. We move at midnight." Graves nodded. Lucien walked to the window and looked out at the North Sea. Midnight was 6 hours away. 6 hours to plan an armed operation against a fortified estate belonging to one of England's noble houses. 6 hours that would determine whether Lucien Ravenscroft remained the disciplined, calculating duke who had rebuilt his alliance through mathematics and rational self-interest, or became something else entirely. Something that even he did not fully understand yet. A man who was willing to risk everything he had rebuilt, not because the strategy demanded it, but because somewhere inside the armored, load-bearing, ruthlessly engineered architecture of his chest, a wall had cracked, and through that crack had come a truth he could no longer suppress. He was not doing this for Blackmoor. He was doing this for her, and if that was weakness, then weakness would have to do. Because strength without something worth protecting was just machinery, and machinery without purpose was just noise, and noise without meaning was just the sound of a man surviving without ever being alive. Gerald had tried to tell him that. Serafina had tried to show him. And now, standing at the edge of a decision that could cost him his estate, his authority, and his life, Lucien finally understood what both of them had been saying all along. The most powerful thing a man can do is not control the world around him. It is choosing what matters enough to fight for without calculating the cost first. Midnight approached. Drake assembled 12 men in the courtyard beneath a moonless sky. Horses stamped against frozen cobblestones. Weapons were checked in silence. Breath rose in white columns that the darkness swallowed whole. Lucien descended the keep's front steps in full tactical dress, riding coat, leather gloves, the Ravenscroft military saber at his hip that had not been drawn in 7 years. He mounted his horse. Drake pulled alongside. 8 miles to Halstead Manor. If we push the horses, 40 minutes. Push them. The column moved through Blackmoor's gates and into the night with the compressed velocity of men who understood that what they were riding toward was not a military operation. It was a reckoning. And somewhere inside Halstead Manor, 8 miles south along a road that cut through frozen moorland like a scar through skin, Serafina Vale sat in a locked room and did not know that the man she had been forced to betray was riding through the darkness toward her. Not with an army, not with a strategy. With 12 men and the most dangerous thing Duke Lucien Ravenscroft had ever carried into battle, a reason to come back alive. The horses hit frozen moorland at full gallop, and the sound was war drums. 12 riders in black cutting through darkness so complete the road existed only as a sensation beneath hooves, the particular firmness of packed earth versus the yielding softness of frozen grass on either side. Lucien rode at the front. The Ravenscroft saber hung against his left thigh, and with every stride the weight of it reminded him of the last time he had drawn the blade. 7 years ago, in a Manchester warehouse, defending a trade convoy against armed men who thought they could take what belonged to him. 7 years. He had governed through ledgers and leverage since then, through intelligence networks and parliamentary maneuvering and the careful application of economic pressure that destroyed enemies without requiring the mess and unpredictability of physical confrontation. He had become civilized, disciplined, surgical. Now he was riding through the dark toward an armed estate with 12 men and a weapon he had not used in 7 years, and the precise mechanical part of his mind, the part that had rebuilt Blackmoor's defenses in 48 hours, was screaming that this was strategically irrational. He did not care. There was something clarifying about riding toward a fight you have chosen rather than one that was chosen for you. The calculations simplified, the variables reduced, the noise that filled every waking hour of a powerful man's existence, political, financial, social, the endless cacophony of interests competing for attention, fell away until all that remained was velocity and direction and the singular purpose of reaching a destination before dawn. Drake pulled alongside him. 2 miles. East approach through the tree line gives us cover to within 300 yards of the service entrance. Guard positions. Scout reports 6 exterior, 2 at the main gate, 2 on the south terrace, 2 roaming the eastern perimeter on 15-minute rotation. Interior. Estimated 12 to 14. Domestic security, as you predicted. Armed with sidearms and batons, no military training. Montclair himself. In the manor, ground floor, west wing, his personal quarters. Lucien calculated distances and timing and personnel ratios while the horse beneath him consumed the remaining ground with the relentless efficiency of an animal bred for exactly this purpose. Drake, Your Grace. Lady Vale is being held somewhere on the upper floors, east side most likely. That is where Montclair keeps his guest quarters, and it is the section most easily secured from inside. We will find her. You will find her. Take 4 men to the upper floors the moment we breach the service entrance. I will handle Montclair. Drake glanced at him. The captain had served Lucien long enough to understand when a tactical assignment doubled as a personal one. Lucien was not delegating the rescue to Drake because it was strategically optimal. He was doing it because finding Serafina required moving through the manor without distraction, and Lucien knew, with the brutal self-awareness that was both his greatest weapon and his most relentless torment, that the moment he saw her face, his concentration would fracture. He could not afford fracture. Not yet. Understood, Drake said. They reached the tree line at 12 minutes past midnight. The horses were left with 2 men. The The remaining 10 moved on foot through frozen undergrowth that cracked beneath their boots like breaking bones. Halstead Manor materialized from the darkness in stages. First the chimney smoke, then the roofline against the marginally lighter sky, then the warm glow of windows on the ground floor where someone was still awake. Lucien raised his fist. The column stopped. He studied the manor's exterior for 90 seconds, counted the visible guards, tracked their movement patterns. Identified the service entrance Drake had specified, a wooden door at the eastern wall partially concealed by a stone storage annex. The 2 roaming guards passed the eastern perimeter on schedule. 15-minute rotation. They had just turned the corner toward the south side. Lucien dropped his fist. 10 men moved as a single organism. The service entrance was unlocked. Lucien processed this detail and filed it. Either Montclair's security was genuinely complacent or the open door was an invitation. Both possibilities required the same response. Forward. Inside, the manor smelled of wood smoke and polished brass, and the particular mustiness of country estates maintained by minimal staff during winter months. A narrow corridor led from the service entrance toward the kitchen wing. Gas lamps burned low along the walls, casting the kind of amber light that turned every shadow into a potential threat. Drake's team split left and climbed the service staircase toward the upper floors. 4 men moving with the controlled silence of experienced operators who understood that speed and quiet were not contradictory requirements, but complementary disciplines. Lucien moved right with the remaining 5. The first guard they encountered was standing at the junction between the kitchen corridor and the main hall. A young man, 25 at most, holding a baton with the grip of someone who had been trained to use it on trespassers, not soldiers. He saw Lucien and opened his mouth. One of Lucien's men reached him first, a hand over the mouth, an arm around the chest. The guard was on the floor and restrained in 4 seconds, conscious, unharmed, terrified. Lucien stepped over him without breaking stride. 3 more guards were neutralized in the main hall, each encounter lasting less than 10 seconds, each guard subdued with controlled force that incapacitated without injuring. Lucien had issued explicit orders, no casualties unless absolutely necessary. He was not here to wage war against Montclair's household staff. He was here for 2 things: Serafina, and a conversation with the man who held her. The door to Montclair's personal quarters was solid oak with an iron latch. Lucien did not knock. He opened it and stepped inside. Lord Montclair was seated in an armchair beside a dying fire with a glass of port in one hand and a leather-bound book in the other. He was 57 years old, thin, gray, the kind of man whose physical presence communicated nothing but whose financial holdings communicated everything. He looked up at Lucien with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit for approximately 3 days and had spent those 3 days deciding how to handle it. "Your Grace," Montclair set down the book, "you could have used the front door. You could have refused to imprison a woman in your home." "I did not imprison anyone. Lady Vale and her father are guests." "Guests whose departure is prevented by 6 armed guards in locked chambers." Montclair sipped his port. His hand was steady. Whatever fear he carried, it did not live in his extremities. "Cedric Ashbourne is a persuasive man. He presented the situation as protective custody. Cedric Ashbourne is confined in my estate for espionage and conspiracy. His protection is worth precisely nothing." Lucien crossed the room until he stood directly in front of Montclair's chair, close enough to make the power differential physically unavoidable. "Here is what happens now. You release Lady Vale and Viscount Vale immediately. You open the Eastern Trade Corridor to Blackmoor shipments effective tomorrow morning, and you sign a non-aggression compact with Ravenscroft that formalizes your neutrality for the next 10 years. Montclair studied him. "And if I decline, then I present evidence of your complicity in Cedric's conspiracy to the House of Lords. Your estates are seized, your titles are revoked, your family name becomes a footnote in parliamentary records filed under treason." "Cedric said you would threaten me." "Cedric also said his conspiracy would succeed. Cedric's predictive accuracy is declining rapidly." Montclair set down his port glass with the deliberate care of a man placing a chess piece. "I will release the Vales. I will open the corridor. I will sign your compact." He paused. But I want you to understand something, Lucien. I did not join Cedric's conspiracy because I believed in it. I joined because the alternative was being crushed between two men whose personal war was consuming everything in its path. Neutral was not an option Cedric offered. Neutral is the option I am offering. Yes, and that is why I will take it. Montclair stood slowly. I will have my steward prepare the Vale's departure. It will take approximately 30 minutes. It will take 15. Montclair looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded and left the room. Lucien stood alone beside the dying fire. His hands were shaking again. The second time in 5 days, the second time in 10 years. He clenched them and released them and clenched them again, forcing the tremors to dissipate through muscular exertion rather than emotional processing. 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, he would see her face. And he had no idea what he would do when that happened. The woman he had trusted had betrayed him. The woman who had betrayed him had been coerced. The woman who had been coerced had tried to tell him the truth before the coercion closed around her. These three facts existed simultaneously inside his chest, and they were incompatible with each other and with every framework he had ever used to process human behavior. Betrayal required punishment. Coercion required compassion. Honesty required acknowledgement. Which response did he choose when all three conditions applied to the same person? The answer arrived not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a loosening somewhere behind his sternum. The architectural equivalent of a load-bearing wall deliberately removed, not collapsing, but being dismantled, stone by stone, by a man who had decided that what the wall protected mattered less than what it prevented. He chose none of the three. He chose a fourth option that existed outside every framework he had ever constructed. He chose to let her decide, because the most brutal lesson Lucien Ravenscroft had learned in 31 years of surviving was that control, absolute, unilateral, total control over people and outcomes in the architecture of power was not strength. It was loneliness wearing a crown. And loneliness, no matter how disciplined, no matter how productive, no matter how many territories it conquered and enemies it destroyed, was a form of dying that simply took longer than most. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. The door opened. Serafina stood in the doorway. She was thinner than he remembered. 9 days since he had last seen her, and the weight loss was visible, in her cheekbones, in the hollows above her collarbones, in the way her dress hung slightly looser at the shoulders. Her hair was down, uncombed. Her eyes were the same dark brown, but they carried something new, something that looked like exhaustion layered over grief, layered over a particular kind of fury that Lucien recognized because he had been carrying its twin inside his own chest for 5 days. The fury of someone who had been forced to do the one thing they could not survive doing. She looked at him. He looked at her. And for 7 seconds, neither of them said anything at all. 7 seconds. Lucien counted them. Counting was a discipline he had practiced since childhood, measuring silence, measuring patience, measuring exactly how long vulnerability could be permitted before it became a liability. But somewhere around the 5th second, he stopped measuring, because the part of him that measured things, the mechanical, structural, load-bearing part that had kept him functional through a decade of warfare and isolation, was not the part that was operating right now. The part that was operating was older, deeper. The part that existed before the inheritance and the military campaigns and the systematic conversion of a human being into an instrument of power. The part that Gerald had seen and tried to protect. The part that a 19-year-old soldier had sealed away in a field hospital and never reopened. Until now. "You came," she said. Her voice was quiet, hoarse. The voice of someone who had not spoken much in several days because there was no one to speak to who would listen. "I came. Cedric told me you would not. He said you would calculate the risk and determine that recovering a traitor was not worth the strategic exposure. He said the mathematics would not support it. The mathematics did not support it. Then why are you here?" Lucien looked at her, truly looked at her. Without the filters of tactical assessment and strategic analysis and the constant, exhausting process of evaluating every human being for threat potential and leverage value. He just looked at her. And what he saw was a woman standing in a doorway with ink-stained fingers and uncombed hair and the particular dignity of someone who had been broken by impossible choices and was still standing. Because some things are more important than mathematics. Her composure cracked, not dramatically, not theatrically. A single fracture that traveled from her eyes to her mouth to her hands, which began to tremble the way his hands had trembled minutes ago. The involuntary response of a body that had been holding itself together through discipline alone and had just received permission to stop. I did not want to do it. The words came out in a voice that was barely controlled. Cedric held my father's debts, every obligation, every mortgage. He said if I did not deliver the intelligence, my father would be imprisoned. Real imprisonment, not confinement, debtor's prison. And my father, she stopped, breathed, continued. My father would not survive that. He is not strong enough. He has been diminishing for years, and the only thing keeping him together is the belief that I will find a way to save what remains. I know. You know. Cedric told me, during our conversation at Blackmoor. Something shifted in her expression. You knew I was coerced before you came here. Yes. And you came anyway. Yes. Even though the intelligence I delivered could have destroyed everything you rebuilt. The intelligence you delivered was based on an architecture that no longer exists. Graves and I rebuilt the entire defensive structure in 48 hours. What you gave Montclair was a map of a building that had already been demolished and reconstructed. She stared at him. You rebuilt your financial architecture in 48 hours. I was motivated. Something happened to her face then, something Lucien had never seen on any human face directed at him. It was not admiration, not gratitude, not the calculated warmth of political alliance or the performative affection of social obligation. It was recognition, the specific, devastating, irreplaceable recognition of one human being seeing another clearly, seeing the damage and the strength and the isolation and the desperate, half-buried capacity for something better than survival, and choosing not to look away. I told you the truth, she said. In the library. Before everything, I told you that your inability to trust was the only proof you had left that you were still human. I remember. I meant it, every word, even knowing what Cedric was going to force me to do. I meant every word I said to you in that library. I know. How? Lucien was quiet for a moment. Because I have spent my entire life reading people. Every expression, every micro-signal, every behavioral pattern that reveals the gap between what someone says and what they mean. He paused. There was no gap with you, not in the library, not during any conversation we shared. The only deception you committed was the act Cedric forced, and even that you performed with the visible reluctance of someone whose body was rejecting the betrayal even as her hands delivered it. A tear fell down her cheek, a single drop that she did not wipe away. It traveled the length of her face and fell from her jaw and landed on the stone floor with a sound so small it should have been inaudible. Lucien heard it the way he heard the North Sea from his study window, the way he heard the 11 minutes of silence at Gerald's grave, the way he heard every sound that mattered in a world full of noise that did not. Come home, he said. 2 words. The simplest sentence he had spoken in a decade. No strategic calculation, no conditional framing, no leverage or subtext or the careful architecture of meaning that characterized every other statement Duke Lucien Ravenscroft had uttered since inheriting Blackmoor Keep. Just 2 words, and they cost him more than any battle he had ever fought. Because saying them meant admitting that Blackmoor was not home without her. That the fortress he had built, physical, financial, psychological, was functional but not inhabitable. That the difference between surviving and living was not a philosophical abstraction, but a concrete, measurable, structurally significant variable that he had been ignoring for 10 years. Serafina crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the pulse in her throat. Close enough that the warmth of her breath reached his face in the cold room. Close enough that if he raised his hand, his fingers would touch her cheek, and the last wall between them would be gone. He raised his hand. His fingers touched her cheek. The wall came down. Not with collapse, not with drama, not with the theatrical destruction of a man surrendering to emotion. The wall came down the way a man removes armor after a battle, deliberately, piece by piece, with the understanding that what is being removed was necessary once, but is no longer necessary now. She pressed her face against his palm and closed her eyes, and for one moment the entire world contracted to the exact dimensions of the space between two people standing in a room that did not belong to either of them. "I will make this right," she said. "You did not break anything that was not already broken." "Then we rebuild." "Together." The word felt different this time. Not the accidental "we" that had escaped his mouth in the library a lifetime ago. This was deliberate, chosen, structural, a word that carried the full weight of everything he had lost and everything he was choosing to risk and everything he was finally willing to admit he could not build alone. They left Halstead Manor before dawn. Viscount Vale rode in the carriage, frail, diminished, weeping quietly with the particular relief of a man who had believed his life was finished and had been wrong. Drake's team escorted the column. Lucien rode alongside the carriage with Seraphina beside him on a borrowed horse, and for the entire 8-mile journey back to Blackmoor Keep, neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Some conversations happened in silence, in the matching rhythm of two horses walking the same road, in the peripheral awareness of another person's breathing, in the shared understanding that words are sometimes too small for what they are asked to carry. Blackmoor Keep appeared against the dawn sky like something out of a painting, granite towers catching the first light, the North Sea glittering below the cliffs, smoke rising from chimneys that had been burning all night because Malcolm Graves had never stopped working. Lucien looked at the fortress. For 10 years it had been a weapon, a statement, a machine designed to project power and suppress vulnerability and remind every person who entered that comfort was not its purpose. Now it looked different, not softer. Blackmoor would never be soft. The stone was too old and the wind was too fierce, and the history embedded in its walls was too saturated with struggle and survival to permit softness. But it looked inhabited in a way it had not looked before. As if the structure itself understood that the man returning to it was not the same man who had left 12 hours ago, and that the change, however fragile, however new, however uncertain, had altered the building's function. Not a fortress, a home. The weeks that followed moved with the deliberate pace of reconstruction. Cedric Ashbourne was released from confinement at Blackmoor under terms that stripped him of parliamentary influence without destroying his estate. Lucien could have annihilated him. The evidence was sufficient. The political will existed. Pemberton and Carrick and Haldane would have supported complete destruction. But Lucien chose containment over annihilation. Not from mercy. From the understanding that a man who destroys every enemy creates a landscape of fear that requires constant maintenance, and constant maintenance of fear is exhausting work that consumes the very resources needed to build something better. Cedric left Blackmoor on a gray Tuesday morning. He passed through the main gate in a carriage stripped of its parliamentary insignia, accompanied by 2 guards who would escort him to his diminished estates in the south. He did not look back. He did not offer final words. He simply left. A predator whose hunting ground had been reduced to a territory too small to sustain his appetites. Lucien watched from the tower window. He felt nothing, not satisfaction, not relief, not the vindictive pleasure that lesser men experienced when enemies were defeated. The absence of feeling was not numbness. It was clarity, the particular clarity of a man who has stopped measuring his worth by the destruction of others and has not yet fully learned to measure it by anything else. That would come. It was already coming. In the library, Seraphina rebuilt Blackmoor's financial systems with the methodical precision of an architect who understands that the most important structures are the ones nobody sees. She restructured tenant agreements to distribute prosperity rather than extract it. She identified and eliminated corruption embedded so deeply in the estate's bureaucracy that even Lucien had accepted it as structural rather than pathological. She worked 16-hour days and argued with every minister who resisted change and won every argument through the simple, devastating strategy of being more prepared, more informed, and more stubborn than anyone in the room. Lucien watched her work. He watched the way servants gradually stopped lowering their eyes when she passed. Not because she demanded respect, but because she earned it, through competence and consistency, and the particular kind of authority that does not need to announce itself because it is visible in every decision. He watched tenant farmers begin arriving at Blackmoor's gates with something other than fear in their faces. Gratitude was too simple a word. It was closer to the cautious optimism of people who had learned to expect nothing from power and were slowly, carefully discovering that this time might be different. He watched his own estate transform, and he watched himself transform with it. The change was not dramatic. Lucien Ravenscroft did not become a different man overnight. He did not suddenly develop warmth or accessibility or the easy charm that other powerful men deployed like currency. He remained sharp, direct, demanding. The standards he held for himself and everyone around him did not soften. But the purpose behind those standards shifted. For 10 years, he had maintained excellence because mediocrity created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Now he maintained excellence because the people who depended on Blackmoor deserved it. The distinction was invisible from the outside. From the inside, it changed everything. A man who works from fear produces results indistinguishable from a man who works from purpose, until the moment crisis arrives and the fear-driven man discovers that his foundation is hollow, while the purpose-driven man discovers that his foundation holds. Lucien discovered his foundation held. On a cold evening in March, 3 months after the night ride to Halstead Manor, Lucien stood at Gerald Hastings' grave. The headstone was simple. Gerald would have wanted it that way. No elaborate carvings, no grand epitaphs, just a name and 2 dates, and the particular silence of a man who had done his work and departed without requiring the world to commemorate it. Lucien stood there for 11 minutes. He counted. Then he stopped counting. "I found her, Gerald," he spoke aloud. The wind carried his words toward the sea. "Or she found me. I have not determined which. She is difficult and brilliant, and she has reorganized my entire financial system, and she argues with me about trade policy at breakfast, and she is right approximately 68% of the time, which is a higher accuracy rate than any advisor I have ever employed." He paused. "You would have liked her. You would have told me she was exactly what I needed. And I would have told you that I do not need anyone. And you would have smiled that smile you had, the one that meant you knew something I did not. And you would have been right, the way you were always right about the things that mattered most." The wind picked up. Salt air burned his lungs. The North Sea continued its eternal work against the cliffs below, patient, relentless, indifferent to the human stories unfolding above it. "I am not the man you remember. I am not the boy you protected. I am something else now. Something that was built from everything that happened, and everything that was lost, and everything that was found after I stopped looking for it." He placed his hand on the headstone. The granite was cold, real, permanent. "But I think, for the first time in a long time, I am something you would not be ashamed of." He stood there a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back toward Blackmoor Keep, where lights burned in the library windows and the sound of Seraphina's voice carried faintly through the evening air as she argued with the minister about grain tariffs. Lucien stopped walking. He stood in the courtyard and looked up at those windows and felt something settle inside his chest. Not the rigid architecture of control, not the hollow efficiency of a machine designed for survival. Something warmer, something that had weight and texture and the particular quality of permanence that comes only from structures built to shelter rather than defend. Home. The word existed inside him now with the same foundational certainty as his own name. Not because the stone walls had changed, not because the corridors were warmer, or the rooms more comfortable, or the wind less fierce against the cliffs, because the man standing inside those walls had finally understood that strength was not the ability to stand alone. It was the courage to let someone stand beside you. And Blackmoor Keep, that ancient, cold, unapologetic fortress carved from granite and shadow and 3 centuries of survival, stood above the cliffs of northern England not because its walls were impenetrable, but because the man who ruled it had finally learned that the most powerful thing he would ever build was not an empire. It was a life worth defending. Inside the library, Seraphina looked up from her documents as Lucien entered. She studied his face the way she had studied it from the very first moment, without fear, without deference, with the calm diagnostic attention of a woman who saw everything and chose to stay anyway. "You visited Gerald." "I did. How was he?" "Still right about everything." She almost smiled. "Ministers are waiting in the South Chamber. The grain tariff vote is tomorrow." "I know. And you are late." "I know that too." He crossed the library and stopped beside her. close enough to see the ink stain on her finger that never seemed to wash out completely, close enough to see the pulse in her throat, close enough to remember the night he had ridden through darkness with 12 men and a saber he had not drawn in 7 years, driven by something no ledger could quantify and no strategy could explain. He looked at her. She looked at him. And the Duke of Blackmoor, Sir Boris Sassmore, the most feared man in northern England, the ruler who had rebuilt an empire from wreckage and turned enemies into allies and survived every betrayal the world had thrown at him, reached out and took her hand. Not possessively, not desperately, the way a man holds something he has decided matters more than everything else he owns. Quietly, completely, without letting go.